My name's Sharon. I grew up with two down-to-earth folks who somehow managed to build up a pretty solid nest egg through hard work, yet chose to live like any other middle-class family. Maybe that's why I ended up like I am, practical, a bit reserved, and with a head for numbers and codes rather than social chit-chat. I had just wrapped up another long week debugging lines of code at work, when my phone buzzed. It was Jenna, a friend from college days, a time when life seemed a lot simpler. "Hey Sharon, long time no see. Got plans this Saturday? I'm going on this old-timey river cruise thing. You should come." Normally, I'd find any excuse to bail. But there was something about Jenna's timing. I needed a break, something different than my usual weekend ritual of coffee and code. So, I agreed. The sun was dipping low when I arrived at the pier. The ship was a charming, somewhat rusty thing that looked like it had seen better days. I climbed aboard, feeling out of place. My usual weekend gear, a baggy sweater and old jeans, didn't quite match the bubbly, dressed-up crowd of strangers. I grabbed a seat at a quiet table on the deck. The ship started to move, and the party kicked off with music and laughter. I sipped my drink, feeling the gap between me and everyone else widen. Then he appeared. David. I didn't know his name yet, but he was hard to miss. Laughing loudly, flashing a charming smile, he moved among the crowd with an ease I envied. As if on cue, Jenna appeared beside me, her timing perfect as ever. "Not mingling, Sharon? Oh, you gotta meet someone. Hang on." Before I knew what was happening, she darted off, and within minutes, she returned with the guy, David. "Hey," he said, flashing that practiced smile, pulling up a chair. "Jenna here tells me you're a tech whiz." "I'm David. So you actually make apps? That's cool. I can barely update mine without calling customer support." His words could have felt like a jab, but his tone was genuinely impressed, making me laugh. "Yeah, I do a bit more than just update them," I said. "It's not so glamorous though. Lots of late nights staring at a screen." Our conversation moved effortlessly from work to hobbies, a rarity for me when talking with someone new. David didn't seem to care that I wasn't part of the usual bubbly crowd around him. As the evening went on, the ship's lights cast a warm glow over the deck, the skyline shimmering in the distance. We were both surprised when the announcement came that we were heading back. "We should do this again," David said as the ship docked. "Let me get your number." I found myself nodding, typing my number into his phone. It felt strangely right, even though part of me was screaming that I was diving headlong into unfamiliar waters. David wasn't kidding when he said he'd call. It was just a day after the river cruise that my phone buzzed. "Hey Sharon, it's David. Free for dinner this week? There's this quirky little place I think you'll dig." I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything. The quirky little place turned out to be a cozy diner tucked away in a side street, filled with vintage memorabilia and a jukebox playing old hits. It was perfect, laid back, no pretenses. As we sat down, David's charm was on full display. He ordered for us both, guessing my likes and dislikes as if he'd known me for years. It was flattering, and a little surprising. "You really get me, don't you?" I joked as the waitress brought over 2 milkshakes, his chocolate, mine strawberry, just the way I liked. "Hey, I pay attention," he winked. "So, tell me more about this app stuff. You building anything cool?" I talked about my latest project, trying to keep the tech jargon to a minimum. David listened, nodding along, but I could tell he was more interested in the person behind the code. "Dinner's on me, by the way," he said as we finished up. "You can get the next one." It was a small gesture, but it felt like a pact between us. Simple, easy. That's how our dates continued, casual meetups, long walks, dinners. David made everything feel uncomplicated. But a couple of months in, things took a slightly different turn. He suggested we meet his parents. I was nervous, obviously, but he brushed it off. "They're chill, you'll see." His parents lived in a well-to-do part of town. The house was large, immaculately kept. They welcomed us with warm smiles, ushering us into a living room that looked like it was straight out of a home decor magazine. "Sharon, lovely to finally meet you," his mother, Linda, greeted me with a hug. "David's told us so much about you." Dinner was served, and it was during the meal that the probing started. His father, George, led the charge. "So, Sharon, David tells us you're into the whole tech thing. Must be good money in that, eh?" I nodded, trying to keep my cool. "It's a growing field. I've been lucky." Linda chimed in, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp. "And they pay well at your company? Must be nice, being so young and independent." "Yeah, it's decent," I replied, focusing on my food. David kicked me lightly under the table, giving me a look that said to play along. As we continued eating, the questions veered towards my family. "And your parents, what do they do?" George asked, sipping his wine. "They're retired now. My dad used to run a small business." "Oh, interesting," Linda said, a flicker of disappointment passing over her face. "And they must be proud of you, making your own way." The rest of the evening passed with more small talk, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I'd just been subtly interrogated. On the drive back, I brought it up with David. "Your folks sure ask a lot about money," I said, trying to keep it light. David just laughed. "That's just them being curious. Don't sweat it." But something didn't sit right. It felt like they were sizing me up, calculating something beyond my compatibility with their son. I shook the thought away, attributing it to nerves. My parents lived in a simple, cozy home, the kind you'd pass without giving a second glance. I loved it for what it represented, a life of genuine contentment without the flash. As David and I drove up, I could see my dad waiting by the door, his expression unreadable. "Hey, this is it?" David asked, looking around as if he expected something more. "Yep, this is home," I said, forcing a smile. "It's not big, but it's got heart." Inside, my mom had laid out a modest spread of home-cooked meals, which I knew David wasn't used to. My dad extended his hand with a firm grip. We settled into the living room, and the small talk began. It was stilted, the air thick with an unspoken tension. David's eyes wandered around the room, taking in the outdated furnishings and family photos lining the shelves. "So, Mr. Martin, Sharon told me you used to run a business. What was it?" David asked, his voice dripping with a curiosity that seemed more about sizing up than genuine interest. Dad chuckled, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, a little of this and that. Ended up trucking for the most part before retiring. Nothing glamorous." "And Mrs. Martin has always been a homemaker?" David continued, his glance briefly meeting mine, as if trying to find flaws in my background. "That's right," Mom answered with a smile, her warmth unfazed by the undercurrents. "It's been a good life, not about the money, but about being together as a family." I could see Dad's jaw tighten as David nodded politely, clearly unimpressed. Dinner was a quiet affair. David complimented the food, but the conversation soon lagged again. After the meal, we walked David to his car. "Think about what I said, Sharon. No rush on the wedding," Dad whispered to me as we stood at the doorstep, David out of earshot. I hugged him, the worry in his eyes gnawing at me. But I was too far gone, too wrapped up in what I felt for David to heed the warnings. Our wedding was exactly like I wanted, simple and intimate. We exchanged vows in a small chapel, with only a few friends and family. It wasn't about the spectacle, but the commitment. After the ceremony, we moved into my place, a modern apartment I had splurged on. David loved it, his excitement genuine as he explored each corner. "This is all ours now, huh?" he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I looked out over the cityscape from the living room window. "Ours," I affirmed, leaning back into his embrace. The apartment felt like a new beginning, a step into our future together. Life with David settled into a comfortable rhythm, one where my higher salary was just another part of our day-to-day. It didn't bother me. I loved what I did and was glad it brought more than just personal satisfaction, it brought stability. His parents, Linda and George, were always sweet to me, especially around holidays and their birthdays. I guessed it was because I didn't skimp on gifts. A fancy blender for Mother's Day, a high-end drill set for Father's Day, you name it, I probably bought it for them at some point. As Christmas rolled around, the gift expectations seemed to have skyrocketed. We were at their house, sipping on coffee when Linda, with a casual flick of her magazine, mentioned, "You know, Sharon, George and I have been thinking about getting new phones. The latest models just came out." I almost choked on my coffee. "Oh, those are pretty pricey, aren't they?" Linda nodded, her eyes not leaving mine. "Yes, but you know, nothing but the best for us, right?" I hesitated, feeling the trap. "Well, of course, but don't you think those phones are a bit excessive?" "I just mean, for what you use a phone for, you don't need the top of the line. It's more sensible." Linda's face tightened. Sensible or cheap? David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mom's right. Why are you being like this, Sharon? It's Christmas." I stood too, feeling cornered. "I'm not trying to be cheap. I just don't see the point in splurging on tech that isn't essential. It's wasteful." David's voice was cold. "So, caring for my parents is wasteful now?" "No, that's not what I said." But he was already heading for the door. He barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was clipped and distant. I was in turmoil, not wanting to lose him, but feeling the unfairness of the situation weighing heavily on me. Finally, unable to bear the Cold War any longer, I caved. I bought the smartphones. Top of the line, the latest model, one for each of them. When I handed the gift-wrapped boxes to Linda and George, the transformation was almost comical. "Oh, Sharon, you didn't have to," Linda exclaimed, her voice dripping with something that sounded like victory. George clapped me on the back, a wide grin spreading across his face. "That's my girl. Knew you'd come through." David's mood magically improved. He hugged me, whispering thanks into my ear as if the past week hadn't been a series of silent meals and turned backs. The day it all fell apart started like any other. I was at my desk early, sipping my second coffee, scrolling through code lines, when the boss, Mr. Thompson, called us into the conference room unexpectedly. "Team," Mr. Thompson began, his voice shaky. "I won't sugarcoat it. The company is bankrupt. We're shutting down, effective immediately." The room went dead silent. Bankrupt? My job, my income, everything seemed to crumble right in front of me. I managed to keep it together until I got home. David was there, and seeing him, I felt maybe everything would be okay. I was wrong. "David," I started, my voice breaking. "The company, we're bankrupt. I've lost my job." He looked up, shocked at first, then his expression hardened. "What? You can find another job, right? Something that pays the same?" His first thought wasn't to comfort me, but to ask about money. It stung, but I pushed that aside. "I'll try," I said. "But it might take some time." The next few months were a blur of job applications and interviews. Each time I mentioned my last company's bankruptcy, I saw the change in the interviewer's face. It was like they thought bad luck was contagious. Money dwindled. Savings evaporated. And then came the day I'd been dreading. We couldn't afford the rent on our apartment anymore. David casually mentioned moving in with his parents. "Until you find something, it makes sense," he said. It was logical, practical, and utterly terrifying. Life at his parents' house was a nightmare. Linda and George's kindness vanished the moment they realized I wasn't the financial powerhouse I had been. Meals were tense, filled with not-so-subtle hints about hard times and pitching in more. One evening, as I was finishing up some freelance work, Linda walked in. "Sharon, dear, try to keep the showers short, will you? Water bills aren't cheap, you know." Dinner that night was an ordeal. I sat down at the table, and George started in before I even took a bite. "You know, Sharon, we're happy to help you two out, but you living here, it's a lot of extra expense. We're not the bank. My fork froze midair. I understand. I'm trying to find work. It's just been tough. David said nothing, just kept eating, his silence a heavy blanket smothering the room. The next few weeks, David's temper grew short. He'd snap over little things, dishes left out, lights left on. "Why can't you just find a job?" he shouted one evening after a particularly hard day of job rejections for me. "I'm trying, David. It's not like I'm not trying." I shot back, my own temper flaring. "Well, try harder. This isn't working. You sitting at home, stuck here because of you." It was as if he'd slapped me. Because of me? Wasn't this the same man who promised to stick by me through thick and thin? Every day, the comments chipped away at me. Linda's snide remarks about freeloaders and George's ever more frequent outbursts about carrying my weight were relentless. I felt alone, trapped. I wanted to call my parents, to hear words of comfort. But I couldn't. I couldn't tell them their daughter was living like this, dependent and despised. It would break their hearts. Linda's birthday dinner was supposed to be a small, intimate affair, a chance to celebrate in a close family circle at a nice restaurant downtown. I should have known better than to expect any warmth in what had become a daily struggle to maintain my dignity. We arrived at the restaurant, and the air was thick with forced pleasantries. Linda was glowing, thrilled to be the center of attention, while George chatted about the expensive wine he intended to order. David was unusually upbeat, laughing more loudly than necessary at every minor joke his parents made. As we settled into our seats, the waiter handed out the menus. I noticed mine looked different, thinner. Confused, I opened it to find a much more limited selection. Glancing around, I saw David and his parents poring over pages of gourmet dishes. "Why do I have a different menu?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David glanced at my menu, then smirked. "Oh, that's the budget menu. We thought that'd be more suitable for you right now." Linda chuckled. "Yes, you know, with no job, you shouldn't be looking at expensive meals. We have to economize somewhere." George joined in with a hearty laugh. "Exactly. Maybe just stick to the bread and water, eh?" I stared at them, the words slicing through me. David laughed along with his parents, thinking it was all a big joke. The humiliation burned in my cheeks, the stares of other diners piercing me as some started whispering, pointing their phones in our direction. "On bread and water?" I stood up, my hands trembling. "When I had money, you all loved the gifts I gave. You loved going out and ordering whatever you liked, because I was paying. And now? Now I'm just a freeloader to you?" The restaurant was silent now, all eyes on our table. David reached for my arm, trying to pull me back down into my seat. "Sharon, stop this now. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" I pulled my arm away, gathering my purse. "No, I'm done. I'm done being the punchline to your cruel jokes." With every eye in the restaurant on us, David and his parents sat frozen, red-faced as whispers filled the room. I walked out, the cool night air hitting my face, a mix of relief and dread churning in my stomach. I didn't go back to celebrate. Instead, I went straight to their house. My hands shook as I packed my bags, throwing in everything I could think to grab. Driving back to my parents' house was a journey filled with mixed emotions. The last few months had drained me, and returning to my childhood home felt both like a defeat and a sanctuary. I found my dad in his usual spot, the old recliner in the living room, reading a newspaper. He looked up, his expression changing from surprise to concern as he took in my state. "Sharon, what happened?" he asked, his voice steady but worried. I sank onto the sofa, the weight of everything crashing down. "Dad, it's all gone wrong. David, his parents, they were just using me. And now, I've lost my job, my marriage, everything." Dad set his paper aside, his brow furrowed. "I saw it, Sharon. I saw it from the start, but you had to see it for yourself. They were freeloaders, parasites." Tears welled up as his words confirmed my worst fears. "I feel so foolish. And now, I've got nothing left, Dad leaned forward, his eyes locking with mine. You're wrong there. You've got something, they can't take it away. Your brains, your talent. Remember who you are. He stood up, walking over to his desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a checkbook and began writing. I've been setting aside money for you, from the trading company. Not for a day like this, but to give you a head start when you were ready. He handed me a check, and I saw the amount. $300,000. My eyes widened in disbelief. This is for you to start anew. Your own IT company, just like you've always talked about, he said, his voice firm. I hugged him, overwhelmed by his faith in me. Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down. The next few days were a blur of activity. I called my former colleagues, many of whom were still jobless after the company's collapse. Hey, it's Sharon. I'm starting something new, and I want you on board. Are you in? Almost all of them agreed enthusiastically, grateful for the opportunity to return to work. We found a small office space in the city center, and I used part of the money to equip it with everything we needed. My friend Jenna, who was an internet journalist, caught wind of what I was doing. Sharon, this is huge. Let me write about it. People should know who's behind the newest tech wave in the city. The article went live a week later, detailing my journey and the vision behind my new company. It caught the attention of potential clients, and soon, we had our first contracts. The call from David came out of nowhere. His voice was cold, detached. Come over tomorrow. The divorce papers are ready. I arrived at the familiar house the next morning, bracing myself for whatever lay ahead. David opened the door, not even bothering with a hello, just a nod toward the living room where his parents sat, looking as smug as ever. There she is, the freeloader, Linda muttered loud enough for me to hear as I entered. I ignored her, focusing on David, who was holding out a stack of papers. Sign here, he said, pointing indifferently to the line at the bottom of the page. His contempt was palpable, but I wasn't there to make amends. I took the pen and signed my name, each stroke a final goodbye to the life I once feared losing. As I set the pen down, George chuckled. Well, that's one problem solved. Good riddance. David's eyes were on the papers, but Linda was looking directly at me, her gaze a mix of triumph and relief. We're finally free of the burden. Hopefully, you can manage on your own without leeching off someone else. I smiled, feeling a surge of satisfaction knowing what I was about to reveal. Actually, I've managed quite well. I pulled out my phone, tapping swiftly, and then showed them the screen. You might find this interesting. The article popped up, titled Rising Star in Tech, Sharon Martin Launches Innovative IT Firm. I watched their faces as they read, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Sharon, where did you get the money for this? David stammered, his earlier disdain replaced by disbelief. My father, I said simply, locking eyes with him. Martin. The owner of the trading company you never cared to ask about because we lived too simply for your tastes. David's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. Linda's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness wiped clean. But, why the modest house? Why live like that if you had money? We never aspired to luxury, I replied, my voice steady. We valued other things, unlike some. The air was thick with their shock and my newfound freedom. David's parents started stammering, tripping over apologies. Oh, Sharon, we didn't mean. I held up my hand, stopping them mid-excuse. Save it. You showed me your true colors, and I've learned from it. I turned to leave, their pleas fading behind me. As I walked out, David followed me to the door, desperation lining his features. Sharon, can we start over? I didn't mean any of this. We can fix it. I looked back, meeting his gaze one last time. No, David, we can't. Goodbye. That final goodbye was the closure I needed. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with incoming texts, more pleas from David and his parents. But I was done. I replied with a single word that felt like the final nail in the coffin of that chapter of my life: no. Back at my new office, I took a deep breath. Starting over hadn't been easy, but as I looked around at the busy faces of my employees, I knew I had made the right decision. These were the people I wanted to invest in, those who valued hard work and innovation, not the price tag attached to their relationships.